Overhaul of the therapy.
Sorry to interrupt the Honourable Minister.
I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Ian Lees-Galloway.
It's a pleasure to follow such a fulsome contribution from the Minister, Maurice Williamson, on the Medicines Amendment Bill. Here on a Thursday morning during extended sitting hours, a time for non-controversial legislation to be progressed through the House, legislation that has broad support from parties around the House. And what an appropriate place for this Medicines Amendment Bill to be debated at an appropriate time, because the issues dealt with in this legislation ought to be non-controversial. They ought to draw broad support from across the House, but unfortunately, to paraphrase Chris Okenvold, it ain't always necessarily been so. Mr Speaker, the Medicines Amendment Bill does get broad support, and it's supported by the Labour Party. We support the fact that the bill streamlines the Medicines Act and amends some specific provisions in the legislation. I think the things that the public will take most notice of is the work towards establishing the Australia-New Zealand Therapeutic Products Authority, having a trans-Tasman authority to oversee medicines and therapeutic products is a sensible thing that we should be working towards. And of course, we've been lurching towards it for some years now, but progress has been held up. And the politics of that I will address in a moment. The other thing that New Zealanders will notice the most is the broadening of prescribing rights. And to be honest, this is the thing that I'm most interested in and most supportive of in this legislation. The ability for, in particular, nurse practitioners, but other health practitioners to gain prescribing rights, I think, is an important step towards improving the accessibility and availability of medicines and of improving the flexibility of our health system. We know that it can be challenging for people to get access to appropriate health care, and that can simply come down to the availability of appropriate health practitioners. In the 21st century, I think we recognise that doesn't always have to be a medical practitioner, doesn't always have to be a doctor. And we received a number of supportive submissions, particularly from the Nurses Organisation and other nursing representative organisations, for the extension of prescribing rights to nurses and to other health practitioners. There was some opposition. Sadly but predictably, it came from the GPs and from the medical fraternity, who seem to think they're the only people qualified to deal in health. And particularly in medicines, it wasn't exactly die in the ditch stuff from the medical fraternity. I think they realised that the world has moved on, and it wasn't exactly the most strident submission from them, but nevertheless, that's where the opposition came from. Mr Speaker, as I said, this is a bill which is necessary and improves the regulatory framework for medicines. But everything contained in this bill, the substance of this bill, could have been progressed 5 years ago had the National Party not decided to play politics with this important issue. The National Party withdrew their support for the then the Therapeutic Products and Medicines Bill, which interestingly is the title of the legislation that we are working towards, of course. But the National Party saw an opportunity to put the Labour government under pressure by withdrawing its support and meaning that bill could not be progressed. This was not in the interests of good health care in New Zealand. This was not in the interests of good regulation of medical products. It was not in the interests of good regulation of natural health and supplementary products, which we are also going to be dealing with this morning. This was pure politics. And Mr Speaker, when I read last year that the Minister of Health, Tony Ryle, is, in the media's opinion, the best politician on the national benches. I thought, you know what, they're absolutely right. He's a terrible Minister of Health. He is ruining the health system. He is setting up all sorts of problems for future governments to have to clean up. But my goodness, Tony Ryle is a very, very good politician. Unfortunately, politics doesn't always make for the best lawmaking or the best regulatory system or for improving our health system, but it can make for good politics. And I know that Dr. Paul Hutchison agrees with all of this. He won't say so, of course, because he's whipped by his party, but Dr. Paul Hutchison agrees with all of this. Now, what did the National Party say that Labor had to do in order to keep their support for establishing good regulation around medicines? It was to take away the provisions in that original piece of legislation to do with natural products. Well, what's the next bill that we're going to be debating this morning? What did we work so hard on, Dr. Hutchison, to align this piece of legislation with? That was the Natural Health and now Supplementary Products Bill, which actually shows how political the National Party's opposition to actually achieving everything that's achieved in this bill 5 long years ago. It could have been done. We could have had nurses, along with folate as well, Ms King says, we could have had good regulatory framework for medicines. We could have had nurses prescribing. We could have had nurse practitioners, particularly diabetes nurse practitioners, doing more to deal with the tsunami of diabetes that this country is facing. We could have been tackling that 5 years ago. But no, the National Party likes to play politics, when actually the thing we are supposed to do is get on and govern properly and do the right thing by New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, this bill and the bill that's going to follow it are both excellent pieces of legislation. It's just such a pity that in this case the National Party actually for once got off their backsides and did something about this bill. The thing is, what they did was completely contrary to the interests of New Zealand. They put politics ahead of the health of New Zealanders.
I call Dr. Paul Hutchison.
Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a pleasure to speak on